There are too many forces, referring to the unions here, who want to thump their chests with them, and what this country needs is a labour market that operates efficiently.
I agree with that. You know what will that mean? It means that we must fix the education system. We must make sure that the workers have the skills that are demanded by firms, in particular in the manufacturing sector. It means that our education system must function, our schools must be functioning, and it means that every school must have a laboratory. It must have all the instruments that you need to ensure that the teachers are empowered to produce the results that we demand.
All right, let's look at mining, because of course mining accounts for 50% of South Africa's exports, big reserves in gold and platinum and that kind of thing. And the strikes that we've seen in recent years are costing the South African economy $36 million per day. That's just one figure. So what are you doing as a recognised trades union leader to say, look, some of these wildcat strikes that are undermining investor confidence in South Africa, we've got to try and get a bit of a control of this. Do you accept that there is a problem with strikes just running amok in some parts of the mining sector?
Of course, that has been a problem, and of course that I have participated personally in processes to try and stabilize that instability in the mining industry, including signing an agreement with all the unions and government business to ensure that there's greater levels of stability. And I think that we've done well in stabilizing the issue of wildcat strikes. What you're seeing now going to the 8 weeks and more is a legal strike. It's a protected strike. Workers have put in a demand through their union, the Association
for a
of
higher
Mining
minimum
and
wage.
Construction, for a higher minimum wage. That's natural in any democracy. There are times where employers and their unions are unable to find a solution in negotiations. But what more important in the context of the South African labor legislation is that most of the disputes between workers and their employers are concluded without the need to exercise power through strikes or lockouts, as the case may be.
But you do accept then that some of these strikes have scared off investors. Tell you what Jill Marcus, who's governor of South Africa's central bank, the Reserve Bank, said in May last year that an increasingly fraught labour relations environment and high wage demands in the mining sector is likely to affect adversely South Africa's credit ratings. Investors are being put off coming to South Africa.
I don't think so that there's a crisis of people not wanting to invest in the mining industry as a result of the 2-month strike in the platinum sector. I do accept that the strike should have been resolved. Any good strike in my diary should not last more than 3 weeks. Because if you exercise power, it must be at the time when you know that the gap between what is on the table is such that you need just a power in the form of a strike to shift parties around and to get a settlement. Yeah. It is unfortunate that the strike have gone 2 months. It shows one thing.
But firstly, this has been going on for a while, and it's cost South Africa hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's not that easy to just turn up the production again, just like that.
Long time ago, if the parties involved in the negotiations were having a matured relationship. You must remember, this is a new union that is organizing the strike. This is its first national strike ever in its 10 years of short existence.
You're talking about AMCU here.
I'm talking about AMCU.
That's the National Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, which is not affiliated to COSATU.
But I'm also raising that issue in the context of the fact that before the strike happened this year, there have been many other wildcat strikes that would have bedeviled the relationship between the parties. And I feel that at a broader political level, there should have been interventions from a broader labor movement, government, and broader private sector to force a settlement between those parties. And I think that one of the biggest regrets about the COSATU divisions, for example, is that COSATU was unable to jump into that opportunity and play a strategic role to ensure that the strike doesn't go on for so long.
There have been rumblings of discontent between members of COSATU and the ruling ANC. Take NUMSA, for instance, the metal workers union, that says it wants to sever its connections with the ANC. Is the ANC becoming a bit of a liability for COSATU?
From the perspective of NUMSA, they have come to that conclusion that the ANC is no longer a reliable friend of workers, no longer can it claim to be biased towards the interest of workers, and the poor in society has been hijacked by the elites and in the national front. And so NUMSA have come to that conclusion. But NUMSA...
But NUMSA, that's NUMSA we're talking about, the metal workers union, but what do you think? I mean, all right, let me tell you. President Zuma said in 2012, the only force that has the interests of our people at heart, a disciplined force of the left with a bias towards the working class and the poor, is the ANC. Is Jacob Zuma right?
When he said that, I agreed with him fully, because the ANC was pursuing the 5 priorities for decent jobs, restructuring education, healthcare, fighting rural poverty, and ensuring that there's rural development, and fighting corruption and crime. With the adoption of the new development plan by the ANC conference in December, and now which is a mainstay policy of the ANC for the next 5 years, I will question that statement wholeheartedly, because I will say the economic policies that the government have chosen now, unfortunately, doesn't put them in the camp of a labor-friendly, pro-worker, pro-poor proposition.
You're opposed to the national development plan of the government, yet a key plank of that plan is to create 11 million new jobs by 2030.
Which is
What's
not
the matter
going to
with
come,
that?
by the way.
Well,
it's not going to come. That's
but
what is written.
Do you disagree with that objective of the national development plan?
The paper,
do you disagree with that objective?
The paper accepts anything written on it. So you can write any 11 million, 6 million, whatever, the paper will accept.
The architect of that is Trevor Mann. Can I just say?
The issue is whether it is feasible, using the instruments that have been chosen by the government, that 11 million jobs will be created in 2013. So this is where I come from.
Can I just say, you disagree with that national development plan? It says let's have a private. It says let's have a private and public partnership to get South Africa working again. The key architect of it is Trevor Manuel in the office of the president. He was a highly acclaimed finance minister in South Africa from 1996 until 2009. This is a man with huge experience. You're saying he's got it wrong?
The diagnosis, the identification of the problems, the objectives that are outlined in the new development plan are things that we will share. We will say spot on in identifying the problems. But the instruments chosen to address those problems, we will disagree with them fundamentally.
Key instrument that you disagree with, just give me one brief example.
Look, it's the macroeconomic policies that they have chosen. I don't agree that a country with 35% unemployment rate should preoccupy itself with an inflation targeting policy that sets that inflation between 3 and 6%, because you can then only achieve that if you use the blunt instrument of high interest rates to drive that inflation down. I think that our preoccupation must be to set targets for employment, for poverty reduction, for inequality reductions. I don't agree that in case of the public enterprises, we should just be privatizing everything. I believe that we should be building a developmental state which will use the instruments, including those instruments used by the apartheid government, to ensure that there is development in South Africa.
You disagree then with President Zuma's comment that the ANC best represents the interests of the working class. So let me put a point to you then by Liv Shang, who is a member of the South Africa's Workers' and Socialist Party. He says, our impression from rank and file COSATU members is disillusionment, especially among younger workers. Their passive disgruntlement is shifting very rapidly to an active search for alternatives. Is this going to render COSATU irrelevant? Because people are going to go and look for the more radical answers, those who say nationalise our resources, that kind of thing?
I've warned that if COSATU leadership suddenly finds comfort with the status quo and are not part of a movement to challenge the fundamental foundations of that status quo, then workers will start looking for alternatives. If COSATU leaders defend what is happening, which is clearly wrong in the eyes of the overwhelming members of its own unions, then it will find itself completely wanting and in no man's land in no time.
Well, I mean, the founding Secretary General of COSATU, Naidu, said in an article in South Africa Sunday Times in late March the 23rd, that now like ghosts, the focused militancy of the past hangs lifeless in glazed picture frames in COSATU bedrooms. For the first time in the history of COSATU, workers have no one to turn to in its leadership.
The trade union movement in South Africa, COSATU in particular, have come to recognize in its last Congress that unless we address worrying organizational trends internally, in particular, unless we begin to address the social gap that is developing between the led and the leaders, the members on the ground, you're going to have to contend with new mushrooming unions coming all over.
Do you accept your days may be numbered?
No, it depends on what we do about those
But
weaknesses.
what are you doing?
If we were to say, and of course we are in a terrible situation now because of those divisions. Precisely, I come from the school of thought that says we've got to be putting programs together to address
But how can you?
And other comrades, unfortunately, are on denial. They say there's nothing wrong with that. But we've got to continue seeing praises.
But how can you do that when you have been suspended since August 2013 as Secretary General of COSATU because of an affair you had with a COSATU employee which violates COSATU rules, and there have also been some questions about financial impropriety. You deny the allegations completely. In fact, you're taking COSATU, you're suing them in the courts, and that case is going through. I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty of it, but 2 points on this. Do you think you'll be vindicated, and aren't you too busy involved in all this infighting in COSATU to really lead the workers?
Look, one of the main issues of discussions in South Africa today amongst the trade unionists is to whether there should be a Congress to reclaim the type of federation that have existed before the current crisis, a federation that is a reliable friend of all the marginalized and oppressed people all over the world, a federation that is regarded to be holding the moral compass of South Africa today, a friend that is known to be speaking truth to power, irrespective of who is in power.
But how can you do that when you've got this infighting?
No, we can't do that because
and you're suspended.
I suspect that people elsewhere were completely uncomfortable with the trade union movement that is truly independent, that is mobilizing society around sound values of our people, of Ubuntu and the people first. And they set up traps to ensure that the organization is divided, weakened, so that
you think you've been set up? You've been set up in a trap, you think, that's led to your suspension?
I think that the mistake I committed in having an affair was certainly blown out of proportion for political reasons. Because if that was people acting on the basis of sound moral basis, they would not be the same people who have no issues whatsoever with the same things happening everywhere else in the country.
So you think it was a trap? And the fact that COSATU headquarters was sold for less than half of its market value, you say you didn't know people might...
Why would
Is this a trap for you again?
That's just absolutely
a trap
nonsense.
By who, though?
No, hold on. Yeah. It is just wrong that one person alone, acting outside the collective of the leadership, determined the price of any building.
So who's setting this trap for you? Is it because you're seen as being a bit of a critic of the ANC, of President Zuma?
Look, when you speak truth to power, you make many friends, but you also make some few enemies.
So when Ibrahim Fakir, a political analyst at the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa, said in August last year in an interview that your suspension strengthens Jacob Zuma's faction within the ANC, is he right?
Is that what's happened? I would not want to look at it that way, but I will say that surely those who find comfort in the leadership of the ANC about the current status quo of where the country is drifting to will be very happy with a pliant federation that will not raise a single finger about the biggest scandals that are unfolding in South Africa today.
Respected political Labour analyst and political analyst here, Terry Bell, says there's a perception that trades unions, the supposedly democratically controlled shields of the workers, had been mere stepping stones to wealth and privilege for the few. He talks about the expense account lifestyle of union bureaucrats. Is the relationship too cosy between big unions and their bosses and the ruling ANC?
I've raised that issue. We've raised it in our last Congress, and we have said that it's one of the weaknesses that we should be setting ourselves up to ensure that we are addressing. And unfortunately, the current divisions won't even allow us to do so.
But when you said at that last COSATU Congress, you said, living in the suburbs of northern Johannesburg, I have access to luxuries that many in our constituency do not. Workers feel that the unions and the leaders fail them by not prioritising their bread and butter issues.
Absolutely, because if a union doesn't do a proper introspection, if you continue to speak about them and not us, then we will not be hitting the problem. The problem in South Africa partly is that there is a social distance. The reason why we ended up with mushrooming unions is because workers could not identify with their leaders' priorities anymore, because they seem to be preoccupied with some of the issues, landing into political office, being a member of the next legislature, this and that, whilst they were feeling that the issues of their bread and butter were completely being sidelined.
Briefly and finally then, what's the future for you? You're going to set up a new workers' party? There have been some rumours.
No, I'm not setting up any. I remain, by the way, I must say this, and I'll continue to say so. I'm a loyal member of the ANC, but the ANC I know has values, have traditions, have certain principles, and which I'm not prepared to trade for anything, including for my position of General Secretary or anything else. That's the ANC I know that liberated South Africa on the basis of its principal principle of our people first, selflessness and our people first and not us first. And that's the ANC that I will continue to serve as a member.
Zwelinzima Vavi, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you very much for having us again.
Thank you.